Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Hello and welcome to the Living Out podcast. My name's Andy Robinson and I'm joined today by my friends and colleagues Andrew Bunt and Anne Whitten. Good morning, Andrew. Good morning, Anne.
Good morning, Andy. You sound like a breakfast TV presenter.
It's my cheerful voice, you know. It's the sort of fake cheerfulness that we have on the Living Out podcast.
I didn't recognise it.
I'm normally grumpy, you see. But anyway, for those of you who've accidentally stumbled across us, Living Out is a group of gay, same-sex attracted Christians who want to live for Jesus and want to live in line with Jesus' teaching on sexuality. And in this series of the podcast, we're considering Ed Shaw's book, The Plausibility Problem. And each week, we're looking at a different chapter. Today, we're considering if it makes you happy, it must be right, which is a common view in our culture. But seeing as we're going to talk about happiness, and since we're recording this early on a Monday morning, I thought I would get Andrew and Anne to tell us what makes you happy on a Monday morning. Go on, Andrew. Anything make you happy?
Well, that is a good question because I'm not a morning person, so I need something to get me through a Monday morning. So last year I joined a choir which rehearses on Monday evenings, and so actually it's a lovely kind of thing. It gets me through Mondays, is knowing I'll be able to end the day with an enjoyable evening, enjoying some singing. So that's what I'm looking forward to today.
Ooh, what sort of stuff do you sing?
It's mostly early music, so we're doing a Handel oratorio, Alexander's Feast at the moment, and a bird mass, so quite highbrow. Yeah, I almost said that. I thought I don't want to say that, but yes, it's kind of quite highbrow, but it's beautiful music, and I really enjoy it. Yeah, it's not show tunes, so no, Ed would be glad.
Go on, Anne.
Well, I'm very much not a morning person either, so I'm happy that I managed to get up on time and make it to this recording. This specific Monday, well, I'm getting my hair cut later, and that makes me happy. Not the actual process of having it cut, but the result afterwards. So, yeah, that's going to make me happy today.
Good stuff. Well, funnily enough, I am a morning person, but not really a Monday morning person. That's not because for me Monday was the start of the working week, but when I was a pastor, Sunday was obviously the manically busy day. So I remember being exhausted every Monday morning. We had a staff meeting on a Monday morning where I was as grumpy as anything. And just to cheer both of you up, I was actually preaching twice yesterday. So I was exhausted by last night. I'm still pretty tired and mildly grumpy. So this is going to be a really good podcast. So we're looking at the chapter, if it makes you happy, it must be right. And for me, this starts with perhaps one of the most emotional bits of the book. Ed talks honestly about some of the ways in which his sexuality makes him unhappy. He talks about his kitchen floor moments where he's in tears because of some of the pressures that come from his sexuality. And he makes the point that in view of the fact that sometimes his sexuality makes him unhappy, that's why people have tried to persuade him the way you're living, following Jesus' pattern on sexuality can't be right. Now, I wonder, Andrew, Anne, as you read about the sort of kitchen floor moments that Ed went through, do you empathise at all on the moments where your sexuality and living for Jesus have actually made you unhappy, would you say?
Yeah, I can definitely relate to Ed's kitchen floor moments. I don't tend to sit on the floor because it's a bit uncomfortable, but I can definitely relate to the pain of feeling like I'm missing out on the one thing that I thought would make me most happy in life. I've been a Christian now for 27 years, and obviously there have been lots of highs and lows, not just around my sexuality, but all sorts of things. But I can relate to the pain of having to say no to relationships. And I think it's been particularly hard when I've fallen in love with a woman and it's been mutual. And there have been times where I've got into relationships and it's been really painful to end them. But then I've had other years where sexuality hasn't been a big issue and there have been other things that have been kind of bigger in my life. And I've really enjoyed the benefits of being single, like community, friendships, travel, ministry, that kind of thing, intimacy with Jesus. So, the pain is real and it is difficult, but it's also not the whole story.
I would fully relate, to that kind of balance of experience. I think for me, some of the things I found difficult, and it's striking, I think different people find different elements of our experience difficult. I found just the feeling of being the odd one out difficult, especially because for many years I didn't really know any other Christians who are same-sex attracted or gay, and all my friends were kind of getting married, all that kind of stuff, and it wasn't so much the pain of not getting married, it was just this feeling of I don't fit in a sense, no one else is going through this, and so it's been really life-giving for me to connect with more people who do, but certainly feeling a minority or odd one out has been a thing. I think also just the acuteness of sexual temptation sometimes, and just the kind of wearing nature of that in such a sexualized culture, actually choosing not to act on our sexual desires can be quite painful, because cultures always send you that message that this is what you need, this is going to make you happy, all that kind of stuff, and so actually choosing to resist those desires, actually there's a level of pain in a sense in that. But my other reflection on this, I kind of wanted to put in, is that my experience of sexuality hasn't been the only thing that's made my life difficult and uncomfortable, or even I think the most significant one. And I kind of look back on the last few years of my life when there's been quite a number of quite significant kind of relational difficulties in my life. And actually, they might be a bit related to sexuality, but primarily they're related to other hurts and other idols in my heart. And I just think it's helpful to me to have a healthy perspective. Actually, my sexuality isn't the only or even the biggest deal in my life. And for other people to know that, because my observation is because people know about my experience of sexuality, if I am finding life difficult, a lot of people just jump to assuming, oh, that's because you're same-sex attracted and you're single and you're celibate, when often it isn't. And people project this idea of it must be this really unhappy situation, assume any unhappiness in my life must be down to that, which just isn't true and is quite unhelpful. So like Anne, we kind of want to balance it of, yes, there's difficult times, there's also really good times, and it's not the only thing in life that's difficult, because that's what life, and especially Christian life, is like.
I'd agree with that. I think it's far from the case that my approach to sexuality makes me permanently unhappy. It's a weird one, aren't there? There are peaks and troughs. So as I look across the long haul, there will be certain years that I felt unhappy than other years, and then within that, any week, there will be ups and downs. But certainly when I read the Plausibility Problem for the first time and read about the kitchen floor moments, I did know what that looked like. For me, it was often the kind of walking around the block in emotional agony moments. And it was partly about the future. Was I going to be lonely as I got old? Sometimes it was, like Anne, to do with friendships that suddenly had started to feel emotionally confusing for me. And that's probably still the element of living with sexuality that I find most painful. Again, sometimes it was just the battles with sexual temptation. And one of the points I've made a few times on the podcast is living with sexuality is an issue of both temptation and suffering. And so whilst I don't want to say the suffering element is permanent, there are times when there's a degree of unhappiness that's attached to that. I want to move on, though, because if we've acknowledged that sometimes living with our sexuality and living in line with Jesus' teaching makes us unhappy, perhaps the church can make life slightly more difficult occasionally, where there can be the perception just around church that everybody is living for happiness. And so for us to embrace a decision that sometimes makes us unhappy just seems weird and baffling. And I think that's the point Ed is making in his book. Are there ways in which we've found the church difficult at times where the perception is, of course, we live for happiness here and now?
I think one thing for me is there's, I think, often a misunderstanding of what Jesus meant when he said he came to bring fullness of life, which becomes like a low-level prosperity gospel of basically following Jesus will make your life good in all the kind of ways you want and culture wants. And ultimately, it kind of boils down to psychological happiness. And people think, fullness of life means I should experience psychological happiness in life, which I think, biblically speaking, just isn't what fullness of life is. Actually, I keep coming back recently to Psalm 73. This guy Asaph, who looks at the wicked around him, those not following God's ways, and they seem to prosper. They seem to be successful. They probably are happy in a sense. And he's looking at his life and thinking it's really hard. And he's thinking, is it worth it? But then he goes to the sanctuary and he sees God, and suddenly he realizes everything changes. He gets a bigger perspective and he realizes the supreme value of God himself. And actually the great blessing of being part of the people of God isn't anything God gives us, including any psychological happiness or success or wealth or prosperity, whatever it is. The great blessing is God himself. And I think that we all need to battle more, including myself more, for actually to prizing God above all things. And actually, intimate relationship with Him is what fullness of life is, not the kind of stuff around it. And I just don't hear that said enough. I've not preached that enough myself and stuff. Actually, that do we truly prize God Himself as the greatest blessing? And that, I think, is what fullness of life actually looks like in a biblical perspective.
Mm. And it's really countercultural, isn't it? Because, Christians should run after something completely different to what the world runs after. But often we don't really look very different. We want nice jobs, nice holidays, nice families, the same as everybody else. I really liked something that Ed said when he said, I'm most encouraged to obey what God says about sex by the costly obedience I see other Christians make in some totally different area of their lives. And I think that's really true. When we see Christians and people at church living to seek God, to seek His kingdom, no matter what the cost to themselves, and it might be cost in terms of money, it might be cost in terms of family, it might be cost in terms of, living somewhere they don't want to live. The flip side of that is, often we see Christian priorities that look very similar to just sort of general middle class aspirations. So, I remember a lady who I really wanted to support me with my same-sex attraction. We had a good friendship. She was somebody from church. We went on walks, and I shared with her the costly discipleship that is involved in stewarding our sexuality well. But I just, in the end, the relationship didn't really work out, because whenever we were walking around the neighbourhood, she basically spent loads of time envying other people's houses, even though she lived in a big, well-appointed house herself. And she couldn't understand the sacrificial obedience, and yet that's at the heart of the Christian life.
If I can be a slightly grumpy old man at this point, I wonder whether we have lost something compared with generations past on this. So, as I read stuff around late 19th century, early 20th century churches, lots of the literature does have language of sacrifice in it. It was a time when there was often a call for people to serve as missionaries in a pioneering context, uncertain as to what their life would look like. And again, the language of giving all for Jesus, living a sacrificial life, seemed to be the language that was used quite a lot in that period. I wonder whether a pendulum has swung away from that towards a more, we basically all have middle-class values and we add a little bit of Jesus in, and that makes us happy and gives us, as Andrew was saying, fullness of life, in a way that is very different to Jesus saying, if you're going to come after me, take up your cross and follow me. And I wonder whether there is a distortion there. And of course, that means it's tricky for those who are living with same-sex attraction, because there is a sacrifice involved in that, and that feels like it swims against even the tide of the church.
Mm. And the weird thing about a life of service and sacrifice is it's not kind of hair shirt, repressive and horrible. It is actually the way to fullness of life. The John 10:10 stuff that Andrew just talked about. It's in giving that we receive, isn't it? That's the kind of upside down nature of the kingdom, that actually the route to true joy and happiness is to live an unselfish, sacrificial life of obedience to God.
Yeah, one of the most encouraging phrases from Jesus in this for me is where he says, in losing your life, you find your life. And I presume that losing your life is quite uncomfortable. I presume that's not meant to feel like an easy, happy thing. And on the other side, somehow you find a greater life. And there's this weird tension in the Christian life that actually through losing a life, which can be uncomfortable, we're finding something even better.
Well, we've set up the problem, and in a moment we're going to look at some of the potential solutions to it.
We've got another of our popular Living Out days in London on Saturday the 22nd of April. Join the team as we explore sexuality in our culture, the biblical picture, and how we can support same-sex attracted Christians in our churches. Find out more and book a place at livingout.org/events.
So we've said, like Ed, there are times when living in line with Jesus' teaching on sexuality can lead to a degree of unhappiness. Assuming we're not just weird people who like being unhappy, why do we live in line with Jesus' teaching? And I'm guessing it's not just that we can work for Living Out.
Yeah, I'm in it for the career prospects and competitive salary. Yeah, Ed makes a good point about short-term versus long-term happiness, and I think we can all relate to that. So to take a trivial example, in the short term, lying around on the sofa scoffing crisps will make me happier than going out for a run in the rain, but it will make me less happy in the long term. I think we've made short-term happiness a god in spite of the longer-term fallout, which often brings a lot of misery. And Ed's example of divorce makes that clear. Often there's this sort of cultural narrative that, if you're not happy in a relationship, then leave, pursue something else. Or if you found somebody else who makes you happy, then you need to chase after them. It may bring, short-term happiness, but the long-term consequences of that can be absolutely disastrous.
Yeah, one of the things for me, it's just about trust. Who do I trust more? The God who made me and designed me and knows me and has decisively proved his wonderful love for me in the sending of his son, or my feelings and desires, which I know change and fluctuate. And I know from experience, often if I follow them, don't actually deliver what they seem to be promising me. So there's actually a thing of actually, what do I actually think is going to be the best for me? I do trust that what God says is better for me than what my desires are telling me. And I think we we probably all have our own examples where we experience that, just actually where we give in to sinful desires and actually it doesn't deliver, doesn't do what you think it wants to be. And I think we can look around society and see that more broadly as well, that actually this narrative in our culture of happiness comes from fully embracing your sexual desires and just kind of doing what you want sexually. I don't think it's delivered the kind of happiness that people want it to. I think there's lots of anecdotal stories of that. I think there's, actually things like the recent book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, I think is kind of pushing against that idea that following our desires is definitely going to be the good thing for us. So for me, one simple thing is just trust. I trust God more than I trust myself. And that makes sense if he's the creator and the loving saviour.
Mm. Yeah, I don't think we're actually very good at working out what will make us most happy. And I think, you picked up on Ed's really good point that cultural attitudes on the way to be happy are constantly shifting. I might think that a committed lesbian relationship will make me happy, but it's really easy to be seduced by, these Hollywood ideals of a shiny romance that doesn't involve conflict or jealousy or ill health or boredom or codependency. I actually read a book by a secular lesbian affirming therapist, and I found it really helpful because she was honest in a way that perhaps pride marchers and rom-com writers aren't, about all the ways that lesbian relationships can go wrong and lead to a lot of unhappiness. And I've actually discovered that myself when I've turned my back on God's plan and thought, hang on, I'm going to determine my own way to be happy. I actually wrote a blog post on this called The Lesbian Urge to Merge, so if anyone wants to explore that and just see what happens when we decide that we can dictate for ourselves what happiness means and how to get it.
And there's the basic pattern of the Christian life, which Andrew's already mentioned earlier, but I was thinking a little bit about the whole kitchen floor moments, because twice I've heard that used against Ed, as it were. Here's why you should abandon biblical sexuality, because it just leads to the kitchen floor. And part of me was left reflecting, good grief, I'm really pleased nobody told Jesus, don't pursue anything that might be costly, Jesus. You really mustn't, because we'd all be more stuffed, frankly, wouldn't we? I'm so glad Jesus took the road to the cross, because it was a road of pain. I'm so glad that as he went to Gethsemane, he prayed, not my will, but yours be done. And it does seem to me Christians particularly saying, you really mustn't take a path that leads to some degree of unhappiness. Basically, they're miles away from the pattern that Jesus takes. It just baffles me that Christians can pursue a line that says you must always do what leads to immediate happiness. It's the opposite of the gospel, quite frankly. And it was why, we're pushing our blogs here. I wrote a blog about kitchen floors and Gethsemane, just to make the point that the pattern of the Christian life will involve Gethsemane moments, will involve moments of pain, but where we say, not my will, but yours be done, Father. Because actually, as it was for Jesus, that is the path to ultimate joy and ultimate satisfaction.
And it's not just a case of, the Christian life being really painful and costly and the non-Christian life being one massive happy party. I think this is something I've worked through a lot over the last year or so, that it's just not true that if we turn our backs on God, there'll be less pain and more happiness. I'd sort of tried to think about what my life would be like if I wasn't a Christian. And, some things would be easier, but some things would definitely not be easier. I think, like Andrew said, this sort of attitude stems from a mistrust of God's good and loving character. And the longer I've been a Christian, the more I've realised God actually knows what he's talking about. He knows me better than I know myself, and he wants to give me a richer and fuller life than I'd choose for myself. And yeah, I guess I just wish I'd trusted him in the first place instead of discovering for myself that going against his design wrecks things. Because, ultimately, I want to be intimately known and loved completely. And I've discovered that it's only by denying myself a lesbian relationship that I'm able to have all that in Jesus. And that is where I find true happiness and joy.
That's brilliant. Just crossed my mind as well that the structure of Ed's book here, what Ed's doing in this book is so important, because sometimes there are elements for all Christians of unhappiness in a sense and difficulty in life that are unavoidable. They're a normal part of Christian life. They're a part of the cost of following Jesus. But there are also elements of happiness we experience because we're not living out the fullness of what God says, or we're not as a community doing that. And so actually, if someone's unhappiness in sexuality is because their experience of sexuality leads them to be single, say, and leaves them feeling incredibly isolated and unloved and not knowing an experience of intimacy in family, there's stuff that we as church family need to put in place. We need to be living out the fullness of what God says, which of course is exactly what Ed is saying in this book. And so it just struck me there's even a balance here to get of all of us as Christians experience some level of difficulty and things that might make us unhappy, to use that language, costing following Jesus. But also sometimes actually when things are really difficult, it's a case of looking at, am I not fully experiencing and living out some of what God is saying? Has God got something better for me? Because so often people's struggles, I think, particularly around sexuality, are really not about sexuality. They're about other adjacent and interlinking things where God has spoken and called us to do things. And I say that's exactly what Ed's trying to do in this book. So in a sense, the whole book actually feeds into a bit of an answer to the point on the misstep in this chapter.
That's really helpful, because as I think about the moments I've been most happy, and yeah, just to let you know, I do have those moments. But those moments when I'm at my most happy are generally when I'm spending time with friends. That would be one element where I'm getting the sort of community that I need, even if that's not in a romantic relationship. But actually, it's with friends talking about Jesus. So I can think of just a good friend of mine who I get to see 3 or 4 times a year, and we're united by a hatred of small talk. So within about a sort of minute or two, we'll be into sort of fairly serious conversation. Just as we talk, we will naturally end up talking about Jesus, actually. We'll just naturally talk about, gosh, he's been so good in this area, or just messed up there, but he's been so kind and forgiving, and spending time praying together. And actually, genuinely, I think I come away from those times, that's probably me at my happiest, where I've done it in community, but I'm talking about the one who is the most precious and beautiful and glorious and happy person in the world. And so to know Jesus is the path to happiness. Because, of course, I mean, we obviously make quite a lot of Jesus as a man of sorrows, but he is an incredibly joyful person, actually. And so Jesus himself is full of joy. And so the more we're connected to him, the more we know that level of joy and happiness in our own hearts. He says to his disciples, "My joy I leave with you." And so as we're connected to Jesus, we know something of his joy.
Taking kind of the long view, I think, is so important as well. Something the New Testament encouraged us to do, to remember it isn't all about the now, but there's a then coming in the future. And that wonderful reality of we are going to be united to Christ, that wonderful wedding day, that eternal marriage that we'll experience. And that's something I've written a blog about, how I love weddings. And actually often I cry at weddings. And that isn't actually, I'm unhappy at a wedding. Actually, it's just the profoundness of seeing this picture of the union that I'm going to enjoy with Jesus, and we as a church can enjoy with Jesus for all of eternity. And when you see the look on the groom's face when he first sees the bride, that's a tiny glimmer to Jesus' depth of love and passion for us, his longing for us to be united with him. And so when things are difficult now, it's just so good and important and a biblical way to approach it, to think actually there's going to be that day when all of this will seem light and momentary. Any suffering now is achieving for us a way to future glory. And actually part of that future glory will be we will be united with Christ in the greatest wedding day there's ever been, for an eternal marriage, which will be the most wonderfully soul-satisfying thing. And taking the long view, thinking about the then, helps us to persevere in the now.
I mean, the perspective that the Bible gives us, I love this phrase from Paul. He talks about being sorrowful yet always rejoicing. And I think that kind of summarizes what we're saying here, isn't it? So just you picking up weddings, Andrew. I both hate and love being at weddings, is the way that I'd put it. So yeah, is there for me a sorrow in pretty much every wedding that I go to? Yes, it will probably kick in during the dancing and the reception when everybody is looking very happy and I'm looking slightly awkward with nobody to dance with. So there will be a sorrow, and I think that's just a natural part of it. And yet always rejoicing, because I am holding on to the fact that this is just a foretaste of the greatest day I'm ever going to have. And so as you put these two things together, I just think we need to be more biblical and say sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. There's always a but, there's always a and. That's what we need to hold on to. And that seems to me a much more biblical, actually a much healthier perspective on life than simply get as much short-term happiness as you can. Let's turn. We talked in the first section a little bit about how occasionally the church doesn't always help. Are there ways in which the church has really helped us to keep this sorrowful yet rejoicing, this long-term happiness perspective, this happiness in Jesus? Any ways in which you've been helped by the church?
I think for me, it goes back to that quote from this chapter, that when I see other Christians making costly sacrifices for Jesus, it really helps me to persevere and to see that he's worth it. So, I'm fortunate to know a lot of Iranian believers who have, come over here because, it's so dangerous to be a Christian in their country. Their lives have been at risk. They've come here having to leave family, leave jobs. Often they've come here and not known anyone, had to get very menial work, and yet the joy that emanates from them is testament to the fact that following Jesus is worth it, and they have a prize that is more important and more treasured than any kind of material comfort or anything that this world can offer. And I just find that an incredible example. So yeah, the faithfulness and the costly discipleship of other Christians is a huge encouragement to keep going, especially when it's tough.
I found it helpful when church has been a context where it's safe to acknowledge difficulties and pain and the cost of following Jesus and just difficulties in your life, and that thing actually not having to try and put on act to say life is always easy and that we are feeling really happy, and it being a safe place to just to articulate and express. Because I think there's something powerful and helps us to process painful emotion, even just when we express it and we tell someone and they are just able to just listen and kind of hold that with us. And so I think one fairly simple thing churches can do is be the kind of places where people feel it's okay to be honest, it's okay to talk, it's okay that sometimes following Jesus is tough. Christian success isn't always seeming really happy. Christian success is faithfully following Jesus in the ups and downs and actually being able to be honest about that, which of course the Psalms are the example to us that we can be fully honest, both with people and also actually with God as well.
Mm. And I think joy and grief aren't mutually exclusive, are they? I think that, in our suffering, in our grief, we can actually have a deep peace and a deep joy, that kind of peace that passes all understanding. I think I've written a blog on this, but I can't remember what it was called. Something like Joy and Grief.
Yeah, when joy and grief meet.
There we go. Yeah.
In other words, what we're saying is the church is at its best when it captures all that we see in the Bible, where it can do Job and John 10:10, I've come that you might have life in all its fullness. When it captures both of those things together and both are expressed in our community life and our songs and our prayers. I think actually I've had the privilege of being a church that has felt like that, and it's such a good place to be for those who are same-sex attracted, because there's room to express the kitchen floor moments, and there's also a pointing to the kitchen floor moments are not the only thing. In Jesus, there are so many reasons to rejoice. Let me finish this podcast. I just want to read 2 Corinthians 6, verse 10, actually. Sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, poor, yet making many rich, having nothing, and yet possessing everything. And I love the end of that. It might be that people will say to those of us who are single, those who don't have a sexual relationship, you've got nothing. And yet in the deepest sense, we can testify to the fact that we really do have everything that is going to matter for this life and the life to come. Andrew and Anne, thanks so much for joining me. Do join us again. The next episode will be released in a couple of weeks' time. And apparently, sex is where true intimacy is found. Or maybe it isn't. Join us again next time. Thanks for listening.